Thank you all for being here. I know it is a miserable, freezing night, and I appreciate you coming out despite all of that. Maybe we can generate some internal warmth here. I'm going to admit this is not the cheeriest of topics to coax you out of the comfort of your home tonight, but I think it's one that all of us feel invested in. We're calling this event Polycrisis and the Problem of Preparedness. And I'm guessing you don't need me to set the scene, but I'm going to do it anyway. Why Polycrisis? Well, some people in the room have been following the outbreak of the avian influenza and are concerned about it spreading more than it has so far. Spreading to more people, spreading people to people. We kind of don't know where that's going, and so we feel a little dread and uncertainty, and think of that as a kind of looming public health crisis. Some of you watched the fires in Los Angeles just a few weeks ago. I know one of our presenters here did closely, or the floods in Kentucky, or just looked at the weather trends showing that 2024 was the hottest year in history, narrowly beating 2023, which narrowly beat 2022, and so climate crisis. Some of you are paying attention to the extraordinary rise of artificial intelligence. Maybe you noted that decisions informed by AI are at the heart of layoffs in the federal government. Categories of workers who've been eliminated. Some of you are concerned about what happens to our future jobs, our economic security, our privacy, technological crisis. Some of you are watching the White House and its confrontation with Congress and the courts and wondering, have we already reached the point where it's okay to talk about a constitutional crisis? Is that looming? We don't know. So there are all these crises happening at once. And there are also people who are saying maybe we should get over the concept of crisis because we're applying it to everything. And it's maybe disabling our capacity to deal with facts on the ground. So if everything is a crisis, what does that get us? That's out there too. And I think there'll be more and more people voicing that concern because as I look out in the world, I don't see many possibilities for these situations abating anytime soon. So that's the occasion for our conversation today. For those of you who are new to the Institute for Public Knowledge, I should introduce myself. My name is Klinenberg. I'm the director here. Also, one of the speakers tonight, which doesn't happen very often, but I'm going to use the power of my position to get myself onto the panel. The real reason we're here is because we want to help launch a new book by my colleague and sometimes collaborator and always friend, Andrew Lakoff. Andy is a professor of sociology and anthropology at USC. He also directs the Center on Science, Technology, and Public Life. We were in graduate school together. Once upon a time, he was in the anthropology department back then. He's kind of migrated over towards sociology and communications as well. I have a list of all the books he's written, and there are lots of them. But what I'm going to say about Andy is that what's kind of unique and especially exciting about his work is that he's been trying to approach these problems that we're all thinking about, including biosecurity, risk of terrorism, climate catastrophe, and pandemics from an unusual vantage. He's really thinking about the fundamental categories, the concepts that we use to approach these issues and make sense of them so that we can act in some way. And Andy's done this whole series of fairly critical genealogies that help us understand where these concepts come from, why we use the categories we use, and how they've shaped our capacity to engage with a whole variety of threats. Andrew was finished with this project in 2019, and then 2020 came and didn't let him finish. We don't get to choose all the choices we make. And so Andy found himself just kind of perfectly positioned to write the book that you're seeing here on the screen, Planning for the Wrong Pandemic, COVID-19 and the Limits of Expert Knowledge. And so Andy's going to talk at the beginning of our session tonight for about 10 or 15 minutes, the big ideas of that book. Then I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes or so about my book on the year 2020 and the multiple crises that we faced. Talk about it from the vantage of 2025, and things look a little different now than they did in the years when I was writing it. But I think it's kind of relevant in ways that I hadn't really understood at the time, too. Then we're really fortunate. Amy Zhang from the Department of Anthropology is going to come and moderate a conversation. Amy's someone we've been trying to get to IPK for a while now, so Andy proved to be a sufficient lure to bring you here. She is an anthropologist and a political ecologist. Her work is on environment, technology, labor, and urban life. Last year, Stanford published her first book, Circular Ecologies, Environmentalism and Waste Politics in Urban China. So the three of us will talk, and then we'll open up to conversation. There are books in the back for you to sign. We like to say here at the IPK that all of our programming is free unless you're a student, in which case $100,000 for you. But in exchange for the free programming, we ask you to try to make the job of the bookseller easier and not make them leave here with a big box of books. So I don't mind if she has to carry my books back, but don't let him bring back Andy's books. I know that Andy would be thrilled to sign books as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Andy, and we'll sit here until the presentations are done. Any, you can sit, you can stand, whatever feels best. And one back here.
Can folks see me and hear me okay if I sit down? Well, first of all, I want to thank Eric. Sure. Well, I first of all want to thank Eric and IPK for the invitation and the very kind introduction. In the program to serve as our moderator. Some of you may be wondering which pandemic book should I buy. Well, Eric's is certainly the more ripping and all-encompassing. I can confidently say that mine is more concise. So do with that information what you will, keeping in mind your limited shelf space. But let me begin. Although the occasion for this event is the 5th anniversary of the onset of COVID-19, it's hard not to open the discussion by acknowledging the current political moment, which is marked, among other things, by a very targeted attack from the executive branch on the nation's health agencies and biomedical research enterprise. And here I need only mention a few recent actions that would have been unthinkable before the pandemic. The appointment of a vaccine skeptic as Director of Health and Human Services, the gutting of key health and regulatory agencies like the FDA and CDC, and the withdrawal of the US from the World Health Organization. So I'm going to try to situate my book, published just a few months ago, but in what now already feels like a distant historical epic, in this somewhat dizzying context of a calculated dismantling of our expert-based health institutions. It's worth noting at the outset that the form of expert knowledge currently under siege is not science in general, to borrow a distinction that Yale makes. It's rather regulatory science, expert knowledge that is brought to bear in making policy decisions, guidelines, thresholds, models, and the like. Some of the characteristics of regulatory science are that first, it's provisional, and yet under immediate pressure to produce actionable findings. And second, the decisions made on its basis often have high stakes in the political arena. And this makes it especially prone to controversy. It's also the kind of expertise, of course, that came under sustained critique during the pandemic, whether in relation to social distancing measures, masking requirements, or vaccine mandates. So one question we might pose is how this form of knowledge oriented toward protecting public health somehow became an enemy for a significant and vocal segment of the population. And in turn, how proclaiming one's belief in science became a way of expressing a countervailing political identity. And here I think it's illuminating to return to the outset of the pandemic when the lines between these warring factions were not so starkly drawn. So just about 5 years ago, in mid-February 2020, the novel coronavirus had only recently been named, while we would later learn that it was already spreading invisibly in New York City and elsewhere. At the time, experts at the CDC, following the model of SARS, still thought containment of the virus was possible through quarantine measures. About a week later, on February 21st, cases were first reported in northern Italy, and 2 days after that, the WHO declared a public health emergency of international concern, which put national health authorities on high alert. And this is roughly when the official US government response began. On February 25th, President Trump introduced the White House Coronavirus Task Force, confidently announcing to assembled reporters, "We're very, very ready for this." The statement would become increasingly ironic in retrospect, given the federal government's chaotic and fragmented response to the pandemic over the following months. But we should recall that at this moment, Trump was invoking a consensus position among experts based on plans and capabilities the US had put together over the prior 2 decades. And in fact, when making this statement, he proudly held aloft a technical report that was called the Global Health Security Index, which had been produced in 2019 by a Johns Hopkins affiliated think tank. The report, which was vetted by leading authorities in global health, had ranked the United States first among WHO member nations in its readiness to deal with the threat of an epidemic or pandemic. And such a ranking was unsurprising given the amount of attention and resources the country had devoted to anticipating a catastrophic disease event. Among other measures, the federal government had established a national stockpile of essential medical supplies to be used in a future health emergency. That's also what the image on the book is. It's from the Strategic National Stockpile. It had developed a national strategy for managing a pandemic, detailing the roles that would be played by government agencies, private sector, and individual citizens. It held multiple scenario-based exercises to test agency responses to imagined outbreaks, from a smallpox attack to a rapidly spreading strain of bird flu. And it had allocated millions of dollars for basic virology research to enable the rapid detection of novel pathogens. And yet, by the end of 2020, despite all of these preparations, the number of cases and deaths from COVID in the US was far higher than many countries ranked lower on the index, from South Korea to Germany to Australia. During this period, meanwhile, I found myself in something of an unexpected and uncomfortable position. As Eric mentioned, I had published a book 2 years earlier that was called Unprepared: Global Health in a Time of Emergency. Perhaps guided by my university's media relations office, journalists began to approach me as someone who had been prescient, asking me questions like, why had the US been caught so unprepared? And what should we be doing instead? This was a sign that they had actually not read the book. I was not a public health expert, but rather an anthropologist of science. And the title of the book, Unprepared, was not a diagnosis or a warning, but alluded to an ethos and a form of rationality that I encountered among a group of experts and officials in the world of global health. The ethos was one of vigilance toward the potential onset of a catastrophic disease event. And the rationality involved a systematic approach to envisioning this potential event and mitigating vulnerabilities to it. The work of these experts had led to the development of a series of preparedness devices, many of which were actually put into motion in the first weeks and months of the pandemic. And in some cases, these measures proved quite successful. For instance, the speed of COVID vaccine development was due both to NIH investment in basic research and to regulatory protocols that had been designed to be triggered in a future pandemic emergency. But in other cases, preparedness did not anticipate what would actually occur. Social distancing measures meant to flatten the curve provoked a massive counter-reaction among those who objected to seemingly indefinite school and business closures. The Strategic National Stockpile, while filled with billions of dollars worth of countermeasures against a smallpox attack or bird flu outbreak, did not have nearly enough personal protective equipment to keep health personnel safe. The regulatory provision to speed biomedical innovation led in some cases to the authorization of treatments like hydroxychloroquine that proved ineffective and even harmful. And the category of essential workers meant to enable the continued operation of critical economic systems during the pandemic heightened the risk of infection among poor and marginalized workers in sectors like agriculture and logistics. So when journalists asked me in 2020 and 2021 why we had been caught so unprepared, I could not help but respond. In fact, we were very well prepared. We were just prepared for the wrong thing. Or perhaps preparedness was the answer to the wrong question. There was a certain rigidity to our preparedness plans, which had been developed in some cases with a bioterrorist attack in mind, and in other cases to address known disease threats like avian flu. Indeed, the Global Health Security Index that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago had been constructed in the aftermath of the 2014 Ebola epidemic and was designed to assist low-income countries in containing a future such outbreak. Experts had difficulty adjusting to the fact that the novel coronavirus was unprecedented and its characteristics not well understood. The possibility of asymptomatic transmission meant that initial quarantine measures were not going to contain the virus. The uncertainty of its rate of spread made it unclear how long social distancing measures would be necessary. And it certainly was not anticipated that the very executive branch that was supposed to rely on expert judgment to make policy would become overtly hostile to it. So coming back to the present, let me try to link this problem of the authority of regulatory expertise to our theme today of polycrisis and preparedness. Something to keep in mind is that preparedness as a technology of anticipation is designed to address the political risks of a future emergency situation. It was initially developed in the context of the early Cold War, and its goal was to provide flexible response tools that could be implemented within existing legal and administrative procedures, so that the executive would not resort, in the case of an enemy nuclear attack, to a state of exception that suspended constitutional government. The various policy measures that I've mentioned, from social distancing to the classification of essential workers to rapid drug authorization, were all designed in advance for a future time of crisis or emergency. During the pandemic, the challenge to expert authority was at the same time a challenge to the legitimacy of such emergency interventions. Perhaps what most exercised those who objected to emergency public health measures was the sense that these expert-based policies were treading upon their constitutional liberties. But again, the form of emergency government that was enacted during COVID-19 was not one of exception to constitutional liberty. All of these measures rested upon statutory authority. It is perhaps ironic then that today it is under a very different theory of executive power, one that does not depend on statutory authority to take exceptional measures, that the apparatus of emergency health response is being wrenched apart. At the base of this project is a narrative of the abuse of expert authority during the pandemic and a suspicion that such expertise was acting to accumulate illegitimate power rather than on the basis of evidence. And it is experts in emergency health response in agencies like CDC and NIH who are being blamed for the perceived excesses of government authority during the pandemic. So with the perspective of 5 years, we might say that the cracks in expert authority that appeared in the first year of the pandemic have expanded into gaping fissures. And as other crises, as I mentioned, whether epidemics or climate disasters, loom on the horizon, it is not at all clear how to repair these cracks. And with that cheery thought, let me turn things over to
Great, thank you, Andy. I see some people in the back. We'll just pause for a second. There's a bunch of seats in the front if anyone wants to get a little closer. I'll pause now if it's less awkward. Anyone want to move us? 4 chairs. Oh, good. You got a better escape route there. And you're going to be exposed to far less of a viral load from anyone in the front here. So I just want to note first that Andy's book really is significantly lighter for your bag as you leave, and also incredibly sharp and analytic. It's good to think with. It's just incredibly provocative and productive, and I promise it will give you a whole new set of frames for making sense of the situation we're in. I'm going to pick up some of these same themes, and I promise even though my book is maybe 10 times as long, my lecture will not be. I'll note also, I'm the director of the Institute for Public Knowledge, and ironically, one of the key themes of my work from the first book I wrote about a heat wave in my home city of Chicago is what I've always called the will not to know. It's kind of a force in our social life and our collective life that does the very opposite of what we try to do here. I noticed it for the first time when I was working in Chicago because I came home to a city that had just experienced this extraordinary event where more than 700 people died in a couple of days, and in the late 1990s, more than 700 people dying in a couple of days seemed like a big deal. Of course, in COVID, we would have multiple heat waves every day for years, to such a great extent that many of us started to feel as if we were going numb, and clearly, whether we were or not, many of the collective us were. We became quite accustomed to mass casualties, almost without a word. Heat wave was a complex event, and one of the things I noted in that book is at the time of the disaster and the immediate aftermath, many of the journalists who covered it wanted to know who was to blame for this failure, and clearly one of the people to blame was the mayor, who had forgotten that the city had an emergency heat plan and therefore not declared it, who had gone on vacation while this thing was happening, who came back and blamed the people who died for neglecting to take care of themselves, accused the media of blowing out of proportion and gotten into a fight with the medical examiner, who we accused of exaggerating the death toll. All things that would recur years later. But at the time when I was writing about Chicago, I insisted it would be superficial and wrong to blame an event like this on any one person. It was a massive and sweeping event, which everyone was implicated at some level. And I really rejected the notion that you can look at an event as complex as a heat wave in a city and say it's the mayor's fault. And there's some ways in which I feel the same way about what happened in 2020, but there's some ways in which I realize that executive power and authority of leadership does matter. And so I want to talk about both the political side of this and the social side of it, because I do think ultimately it would be wrong to say that the crisis of 2020 was about the president at the time. It would also be wrong not to say that the president had an impact, and that what the White House does is going to shape our capacity to deal with the many crises ahead. I think, first of all, on the will not to know, that it has been consequential. Our failure to reckon with what we experienced in this country in 2020, not to make sense of why so many of our institutions broke down, about why trust diminished, about why we didn't do many of the things that nations very much like us were able to do to address the emerging crisis and the prolonged crisis, had real consequences. I think it's been hard for us to go back to 2020 and make sense of it. It's an unpleasant thing to remember. I can't tell you how many book events I've been to where someone says, I'm really happy I read this book, but it was a really hard book to read. It was really painful to read. And I've had many people say, it's too soon to talk about 2020. The other day I was at an event and someone said, I've always wondered, I'm a historian, and I've always wondered, why is it that it's been so difficult for us to make sense of the great influenza pandemic of 1918? The classic book on that experience in the US is called America's Forgotten Pandemic. So when I was assigned your book to read, I realized, now I understand why it's hard. It's difficult to do this, but our refusal to go back and look at the things that broke down has really put us in a tough spot. I think, first of all, we're still suffering from what I think of as a long COVID as a kind of social condition, a social disease, not to belittle long COVID as a medical condition, which I think is real and serious. But there's also a way in which we're still in the grips of the anger and the distrust, the division, the sense of betrayal that so many of us felt in 2020. If there's a through line that goes through the 7 experiences of individuals that I profiled in the book 2020, it's a feeling of being on their own, feeling like the core institutions that are there to provide protection not doing the job that they're supposed to do. And I think that feeling is with us. I think that feeling is a big source of the answer for the question of why is it that despite so many numbers that we've relied on to tell us how we should be feeling about things like the economy are belied by our experience. Americans have so many reasons to feel better about the world today than we did in 2020, and yet there's something off, right? So you remember the whole conversation about the vibe session? The economic data tell us we should be okay, but something's wrong. I think part of it is that we haven't really gotten through that sense of anger or betrayal we felt in 2020. I think also we saw something about ourselves in 2020 that we can't unsee. A kind of level of dysfunction and chaos that's with us now. Part of it was a will not to know, even in the moment. Some of the quotes that Andy shared about America's kind of official stance, we're fine, we have things under control, this will go away quickly, we're doing everything that a state could do. That kind of sentiment was belied by what we all witnessed in the early days of the pandemic, especially when it comes to not wanting to know, being unwilling to know. Recall at the very beginning, for instance, the president turning away a cruise ship full of Americans, some of whom were infected with this new virus because he wanted to keep the numbers where they were, right? But now we're in a different moment, and Andy mentioned this towards the end, but I think it really is worth us pausing to consider more seriously. We now are in a situation where the federal government is not only trying to end vital programs that track the transmission of the virus or the melting of glaciers or the warming of air temperatures or the rising sea levels. Not only are we seeing those things eliminated, but we're seeing an active effort to delete data we've already collected, to erase records that are there, so that if you wind up in the conversation that we had earlier today in a small seminar with Andy, what's a conspiracy theory and what's the established sentiment based on scientific findings, might be increasingly difficult to come up with an answer we can agree upon. What counts as knowledge? Where does it come from? And how do we act in a moment where an influenza is circulating and the CDC and the NIH are losing their capacity to track it, let alone to seek out a cure? That said, I think it would be a mistake to focus too much on what happens at the White House. It's not all about that. The issues about trust and trust in government even aren't simply about one person's act or one office. I think a lot about the concept of the essential worker that came up in 2020. I actually talked about it for a few minutes in an event earlier this year on solidarity. Remember the idea of essential workers? That notion that when COVID was at its scariest moment, when we had the most uncertainty about what was happening, we didn't understand the virus, we didn't know how to treat it, we didn't know who would be affected. The idea was that all of us should stay home, close down the offices, close down all gathering places, no gyms, no schools, no bars, restaurants, except for this new category. It wasn't actually new in the sense that it had been developed years before, but it was new to most of us. The essential worker. And so we created a category of people, and we said you need to go out to work. And one would think that a society that names this thing, there are some people who are essential and others who are not, would also be taking on a kind of moral obligation to protect that class of people. But instead, of course, as you know, in the United States, to be called essential was to be deemed expendable. And people who were categorized as essential workers had massively higher rates of disease and death, and brought the disease home to their residences where they exposed members of their family. who also had higher rates of death. So we asked all of this from working class people. And just so we can all see, just could you raise your hand really high if you feel like you've been talking a lot about essential workers the last few months? Their fate? Anyone? The whole thing has disappeared as if it didn't happen, as if we hadn't had this moment of recognition that there's some people who we asked to do this work who are owed something which we have not delivered on. So when I think about the distrust and the anger and the sense of betrayal, in America, I think it's not just about something the president did, it's also something that we collectively decided to do, not the naming, but the forgetting, and the will to move on, as if it didn't happen. I guess it's also useful to mention that it would be short-sighted of all of us as political subjects to think that the deception, that the manipulation of knowledge was restricted to the White House. Here in New York, Governor Cuomo at the time made quite an aggressive effort to manipulate the data on nursing home deaths so that there was dramatic undercount, and people in New York did not know until there was independent investigations to see what had happened, that people living in nursing homes were as vulnerable as they were. Gavin Newsom in the state of California asked everyone to lock down and stay home, and went out to dinner with a group of friends at one of the most expensive restaurants in the world. It's hard to foster trust in an environment like that. One of the characters I profile in the book is a man named Daniel Presti from Staten Island. He was a bar manager who opened a bar in late 2019 with a buddy, with the idea of building a place for community cohesion, where people could hang out, get to know each other. And his experience over the course of 2020 was, the bar got closed. He was okay with that at first. Seemed like a reasonable thing to happen, but couldn't get information that was reliable about when he'd be able to open for a short time, closed down again. When he tried to talk to local officials, to the mayor, to the governor's office to get information, he was turned away. It was a new establishment. It was hard for them to get stimulus money. And Presti, like a lot of small business operators in the United States, had far less access to public money to stay above water than big businesses like the Cheesecake Factory that had lawyers ready to get everything possible from federal relief efforts. And the US, although it had a kind of terrific stimulus plan in many ways, also let a lot of people fall through the cracks. Presti was one of them. And over the course of 2020, he found himself getting more and more radicalized on the right until he finally decided he would not obey the order to close down his establishment and instead declared that his bar was an autonomous zone that attracted the far right, including the Proud Boys for rally, and then the sheriffs, and resulted in arrest and news and scandal. Distrust is part of that story as well. This wasn't inevitable. In the book I write about the case of Australia. I think it's really important for those of us who want to make sense of the current situation in the US to look at what comparable nations around the world did in the face of this particular threat, and to look at how they're treating similar threats today. Australia began 2020 as a quite polarized society. It had a right-wing prime minister. It had deep cultural divisions, a streak of individualism, a record of being relatively distrustful on lots of matters. But over the course of 2020, trust in government, as well as in fellow citizens, rose significantly in Australia. The response from the state was far more unified. It turned out in time, reporters discovered that the prime minister had given himself far more authority than the public had realized, and there was a backlash. There was a backlash against the lockdowns, especially in the province of Victoria, state of Victoria. And there were protests, but nothing at all like what happened in the United States. That's not even comparable. And it's useful to know that in a politically polarized society with a federal government and quite restrictive policies, it's possible for trust to go up. I say all of this because, to end, I think one way to manage a crisis, whether it's climate, pandemic, political, technological, one way to manage a crisis is to be transparent about the threat, about the fear, about what we know, about what we don't know, to debate it, to have subject it to some democratic process, to look for expert guidance, but to recognize that in the future, as in 2020, with no matter what the expert knowledge is, ultimately we have certain political offices that have the special responsibility of making the biggest decisions. As powerful as Fauci and Collins and the leaders of the public health community were in 2020 at giving us concepts, at setting terms, at helping us think about what it would mean to flatten a curve. At the end of the day, we have an executive branch. We have Congress and the Supreme Court that have outsized power. So one way to deal with it is to have debate. And doing that well requires some level of social cohesion, some capacity to cooperate, some capacity to dig down and establish lines of trust where otherwise distrust would be the default, as it so often is these days. But I think the other way to deal with crises, as we know, from looking around the world and increasingly from looking at home, is to do it with repression, with force, with power. And I think one of the things that's so worrisome today is if we look at our country, we can see where we're headed. And I guess where that leaves me is I very much hope that in the next few years we're lucky, because I don't think we're prepared. All right, thank you very much.
Okay. So first of all, I just want to thank Eric and Andy for giving me the opportunity to sit down and think with their excellent books, right? As Eric's opening alluded, right, picking up a pandemic book is maybe not the first thing we reach for, but their vivid descriptions, the analytical depth of these books and the characters and rich storytelling really forced me to linger in this time, right, for a moment. And I'm really glad I did, right, saying this as someone who spent most of the pandemic in New York City. So this forced reflection that the books forced me to undertake really made clear that thinking through the stakes of this period in our recent history is really critical for making sense of this recent political moment. And I just also want to say that they were both engaging and enjoyable reads, and everyone should go and get both copies right at the end of this talk. So I've really read these books quite recently, so a number of themes are swimming in my mind, right, that I'm just going to throw on the table for us to pick up on, right? The theme of political polarization, the infodemic, biological preparedness, distribution, mutual aid, racial divisions, the essential worker, among others, right? And I was going to start initially by asking you to think about 2020 from 2025, but I think we've kind of done that through your intro. So let me start maybe by asking you about early responses on the pandemic and how it unfolded, right? Which you both really grapple with in the book. But I really see perhaps two distinct arguments, right? And Andy, I think in your work you really take this longer view to preparedness, right? Thinking about how previous strategies of preparedness in the Cold War, through anthrax, H1N1, avian flu, in a way gave way to certain bureaucratic expertise and rationales in guiding our response to COVID, right? And I read really your argument as one about how the determining effects of bureaucratic rationalities of the past ended up structuring, right, the responses in the present. And Eric, I think you take a slightly different approach, right? I think in your account, you really emphasize, and I picked up on some of this in your intro, right? The extent to which political leadership at the moment of the Trump regime really in a way upended, overwhelmed, and to a large extent undermined regular procedures and norms of responses and public messaging, right? So I really wanted to get your thoughts on these divergent accounts. But really also, right, I think I'm asking this question as a way of thinking about how to periodize 2020, right? Which I think, Eric, in your epilogue, you really see it as a kind of discontinuity, a moment of rupture, right? You kind of use this Tua's idea of this being at the end of neoliberalism from 1970s to 2020, this being the significant year marker, versus Andy, I think I see very much in your book an argument for certain sort of bureaucratic rationales, right, as one of a continuity, right, in guiding future ideas of preparedness. So, a long-winded question, but I'd love your thoughts on this point. Thanks.
Why don't you go first, Andy? I'll say one thing that on the Tu's point, and actually my view was some people were saying it was the end of neoliberalism and the end of populism. I disagree with both of them. I thought neoliberalism and authoritarianism are going to be a lot more resilient than we think. But I want to get back to the other things. And do you want to go?
Yeah, so maybe to restate the question in a way you're asking, it's almost a determinism question of how the extent to which certain kinds of failure were built into the forms of reasoning that were put into motion at the early stages of the pandemic. And it's a kind of historical simulation that we can't run. What would this have looked like under a different federal political administration? I do think that the first couple of months are looking at really looking at carefully in this regard, in the sense that a lot of these measures, as I said in the intro, a lot of the measures that became quite controversial, for example, social distancing, the essential workers policy, they seem to come out of nowhere. They seem to come to be sort of flattening the curve. They seem to be kind of ad hoc responses, but in fact, they were built into CDC and FEMA plans from the early 2000s onward, and those did have unanticipated consequences, kind of independent of the political leadership. I think that with different political leadership, more trust could have been built, and there might have been more flexibility for transforming those policies while sustaining public trust. So this period of polarization, which was probably the late spring and summer 2020, might have been alleviated under different political leadership. So I don't mean to say that the kinds of failures we saw were predetermined by this form of bureaucratic rationality, but I do think that there were early moments when public health leaders could have been more transparent about the uncertainty and contingency of the directives that they were putting into place.
Yeah, I guess I would say, again, we can learn a lot from comparisons. So this kind of epistemic regime that you described, those techniques of disease management were used by other countries like the United States with far more effect because of the lack of chaos and dysfunction and direct underwriting. It's just fair to say the United States had a significantly higher excess death rate, especially during those early months, than other countries that were like us during the first year. In my book, the metric I use to think about the effect of 2020 on the United States is not just mortality and morbidity, but also trust and cohesion, and there we took an enormous hit. And this is where I think we really see the influence of the kind of chaotic, dysregulated leadership. It really did matter, and some of it was the kind of magical thinking, promising that it would be fine and it would go away by Easter. In the book, there's a chapter about this question of why in most countries there were not ferocious and violent conflicts over masks. But in the United States, we had those in abundance. It's not to say that in every country people were thrilled to wear masks. Some places with long histories of mask wearing had higher rates of mask wearing for sure, as we would expect. But like England's a really interesting case. levels of mask wearing were lower than in the US, but they weren't organized around political ideology, at least for the first year. Just some people liked to wear masks and others didn't for other kinds of reasons. In the US, when the president rolled out the new CDC guidelines in early April that all Americans should wear masks when they're in public settings, he offered that announcement and then in the next breath said, personally, I'm not going to do it, which is very confusing for people in a time of uncertainty. So it quickly became clear, not just that was his personal preference, but that he didn't want anyone in the cabinet or in his orbit to wear a mask because masks for the White House were a sign of fear and cowardice and femininity and weakness. And so maybe you remember a few days after this, Mike Pence. Remember Mike Pence? Mike Pence, who was actually the head of the task force. Some people use doctors. We use Mike Pence. Mike Pence goes to the Mayo Clinic, which for those of you who don't know is the place you go when your health problem is so complex and serious that no one where you live can diagnose you and find a way to treat you, so you go to the Mayo Clinic. And so Pence goes to the Mayo Clinic where he's like the only person in his zip code to not wear a mask, which he does proudly. And soon, it becomes clear that if you're on the right, that bearing your face is a way of signaling your solidarity with the politics. And just so if that's not your team, if you're not on Team Red, just so you don't feel too good about yourself, suddenly on Team Blue, what everyone started to do was to change their photo on social media. So here's Eric in a mask. Remember this? And it was on Twitter, Andrew's Andrew hashtag wears a mask, Lakoff. And the political candidates were, because Andy's not on social media. Exactly. But the political candidates started doing their photos and their videos wearing masks, because if you were on Team Blue, then mask was your way of signaling solidarity with politics. And so basically what happened is that we invested all of the weight of our political baggage in this little piece of fabric. And first it was masks, right? And then it became vaccines. But then it became medications, right? It was like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. And then it turned to vaccine, and now we find ourselves so divided. And we're not the only place that has divisions over vaccine, but even France is nowhere near where we're heading with RFK Jr. So I guess in this, I really think the politics matters, and we need to make sense of it.
Let's add one example that I think is telling, which is the yard signs that reminded everyone that soon after the pandemic that declared a series of moral political positions that people in my neighborhood, including we in this house, we believe. Love is love. Science is real. I thought it was really interesting. I'm a critical analyst of the production of scientific facts. And so I found it really intriguing that part of the set of moral positions that one felt pressured to espouse at this moment of political polarization was belief in science per se, which as you could probably detect in my opening remarks, to me is a slight misreading of what was at stake in these debates over expert knowledge. But nonetheless, as Eric is saying, the population was forced into these contesting positions around a whole number of sort of symbolic totalism.
Thank you. So your book is full of these amazing facts, and the mask one that you just recounted was one that really surprised me. The other point that you shared in the book that really surprised me was that you say before 2012, you're more likely to have trust in the state if you're a Republican, and after that it shifts to the other side, right? So there's this periodization of the polarization that the pandemic both hastened, right? And I wondered, I still think there's more to be said about this period and how you would look back on COVID, right? Really speeding up some of these processes that were already underway. So I was curious about your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, so I do think of the 2020 as the beginning of beginning is even a funny term, but it's certainly an acceleration of a rupture. I don't think it's with neoliberalism, but it does seem to me like it's a rupture away from the kind of forms of technocratic governance and expertise that Andy's writing about. So I guess the question at the moment, and I brought this up in the beginning, is like, is this book in some ways like an epitaph for an approach to governance on a range of topics that we will, now look back on with some longing, because it will be increasingly difficult to manage crises with the tools that Andy and I write about if we tear apart the toolboxes and throw those tools into the sea. And I mean, it's so interesting, like pay attention to the original conceit in Andy's presentation, which is all of these techniques for management, for preparedness, were designed so that the nation state could operate without declaring a state of emergency, to operate within the confines of the constitutional order. Now we've completely flipped the script on that, because the tool of governance that we're seeing used is to declare emergencies on all kinds of things that seem like they are actually fairly typical, rather than signs of an emergency. And that has become an excuse to govern in this state of exception. And it strikes me that it's going to be very difficult to walk away from that even if there's some kind of regime change 4 years from now, the temptation to use those same tools to change the radical transformation that we're going through now, that will be very tempting. So I guess that's the rupture I'm thinking about, and I guess that's associated with a bigger rupture that we're all wondering about, like kind of what's the fate of this democratic constitutional order.
Yeah, I'm going to pick up on the epitaph comment that Eric made, and I alluded to this when saying in my opening remarks that even though this book was published in late 2024, it feels like a different historical moment. Of course, we don't know yet what will happen in the next year, 2 years, 3 years, but it is possible that a kind of 75-year-long agreement on technocratic, let's call it technocratic democracy within constitutional liberalism, like it probably begins in the progressive era and intensifies in the Cold War in the U.S. Maybe now being eclipsed, and this will look like that the formation that I had been studying in these books will look like a past formation that has been disassembled, and as you say, we may be decided for it.
So I guess we can maybe jump into this current confusing moment, right? I also found the concept of infodemic, right, really powerful, right, in thinking about all of the things that were happening right alongside the pandemic. And obviously during the pandemic, a lot of things became difficult to talk about, and one of the things was the origins of COVID-19, right? And Andy, so in your last chapter of your book, right, you discuss this competing theory, right, the zoonotic spillover theory versus lab leak. And I think give one of the most convincing but ironic, right, accounts of that I've ever read on the possibilities of seeing, of really considering the lab leak theory from this perspective of preparedness, right? And your frame is interesting because it essentially shifts the attention and focus from China to global and U.S. scientific and institutions and communities such as the NIH. And in your telling, Wuhan essentially becomes this contingent site, right, in this global story of knowledge production. So, I'm really interested in this framing because it really has the potential to really avoid this highly polarizing debate around the origins of the pandemic that's spawned so much xenophobic and hate. But so I want to invite you to talk a little bit more about this, right? But also to ask both of you, right? Do you think this is right in this current moment? Have we had enough distance to be able to return to this question of the origins of the pandemic and what are the stakes of that? To ask Andy a little bit about your reflection on models of experimental laboratory science, right, as a mode for predicting outbreaks, which I think you offer a critique of. And also what types of political guardrails and precautions, right, do we really need when we're thinking about politically fraught issues in this age of infodemics, right? So what are some of these questions?
Well, I'll start. So this was a really complex chapter to write. Maybe it's why it's the last chapter. Because of course, I didn't feel equipped to take and didn't want to take a position on the origins of COVID debate. I did begin with the position that it's still not definitively determined. And so the way that I ended up posing the question, just in relationship to the analytic tools I had, was what are the conditions of possibility for this to have potentially been a lab leak, and how does that relate to the history of preparedness that my book is describing? And so my argument, which you characterized well, is that gain-of-function research, this technique that tries to amplify either the severity or transmissibility of a virus, it's designed to test whether a given virus is potentially a pandemic virus. And so in the early 2000s, virologists, the international virology community pitched to research agencies like NIH the idea that it would help in the pandemic preparedness program to be able to, for example, track the mutations of avian flu over time to see whether they were becoming closer and closer to an easily transmissible strain, easily transmissible among humans strain. And so, for example, they did tests in ferrets where they did serial passaging experiments to see if they could make, through these experiments, make the H5N1 virus more easily transmissible. So the argument that I make is that you actually have to consider gain of function as a technique of preparedness that had potentially unpredictable consequences. And it's a kind of part of a broader argument in the book about blind spots of preparedness. So I'll leave it at that, and I guess the last thing I'll say, and this gets back to the earlier conversation about polarization, is that it became a kind of impossible discussion to have in the center or center-left mainstream because positions became quite polarized, and it was characterized as xenophobic to suggest it might have been a lab leak, although of course, as Amy just said, it would have been, under that scenario, it was funded by the NIH, among other US-based organizations. And so, it became sort of a third rail of conversation to bring up the possibility. And I think it still kind of is, and I think that we, and by we I mean kind of the critical intellectuals in the academy, should also reflect on our kind of self-censorship around this question, which remains, I think, a valid question.
Yeah, I think that question is being taken up more. I think one consequence of the U.S. pulling out of the WHO should take us back to the early days of 2020 when we learned that under the first Trump administration, the U.S. had pulled resources out of a lot of epidemiological, collective epidemiological research projects, including disease surveillance and monitoring. And now those kinds of projects are being conducted by countries all over the world. It's not just the NIH that's funding that research, and the US is out of it. And so here we've entered terrain that's a little bit like geoengineering and climate, where there's no international system of governance. A whole variety of states can experiment. The experiments themselves are risky. And the US being out of it doesn't mean that we're immune from the consequences of it. On the infodemic, I just want to point out to say that Melina Sherman, who is a postdoc for me on the project, who actually is like a link again to Andy, a graduate student of Andy's at USC in the Annenberg School. I was here tonight, and I haven't seen her in a long time. She's been living in Brazil, was a postdoc on this project, who worked with me on there's a part of the book where we really look at this kind of emergence of the infodemic, misinformation, disinformation. We tracked the conversations that people were having about 2020, the pandemic in particular, but all over a whole variety of things, on 2 right-wing social media, Facebook groups, and some progressive groups and some liberal groups, just to see how different the various conversations were. And it really was the case that in 2020 you were living through fundamentally different pandemic experiences and social experiences, depending on which social media group you immersed yourself in. I guess it's also notable on the infodemic that one of the things that emerged in 2020 was the problem that leaders from NIH and the CDC had in engaging in, cost-benefit conversations, deliberations about the risks and of certain tactics, because you remember at the time the president was suggesting things like not just ivermectin, but injecting Clorox as a remedy. And so that, when we speak about infodemic, I think it matters that we live in a moment where there's authoritarian leaders who are framing the discourse in ways that make it very difficult for there to be for reasoned deliberation. And as political leaders get punitive with scientific experts and the federal agencies that are responsible for producing authoritative, actionable knowledge, I think that distorts the discourse even more. So those are the kinds of emerging infodemic problems that I'm concerned about. It's not just getting misinformation or disinformation on Facebook and Twitter. It's also like what happens when that knowledge gets embraced by political authorities who are interested in punishing dissent. And, well, I should say that dissent could also come from journalists and from academics in universities like this one. So I think it's no surprise to see this kind of attack on truth-seeking institutions at the moment. Our world and the public sector too.
2 more questions? How much time do we have? Maybe I'll ask you a little bit. So Andy, your book left me with the impression that preparedness as a strategy was essentially this question of intergovernmental coordination and distribution, right? So all of these scenarios from base testings just revealed all of these fault lines between intergovernmental agencies. However, reading Eric's book, right, you really made clear that the effects of COVID, right, from the ground is highly, right, really about the local level, right, across race, neighborhoods, between the young, those who live alone. So I'm wondering, Andy, do you see disaster preparedness really as a form of state logic that's essentially blind, right, to operations on the ground, right? How does operations on the ground really inform thinkings about preparedness that account for issues of social difference and inequity at the local level? Has COVID changed some of these discussions in the communities that you work with? Okay, sounds great. Yeah, it's getting late. Yeah, I'll leave it here.
Yeah, and I should also kind of mention that there's a certain narrow purview to the book, that it really does focus its attention on this space between expert knowledge and governmental practice at the federal level. So there's a whole set of stories about local response and the experience of local public health agencies, local emergency managers, that is not, and how they do and do not take up the guidelines, the mandates, the models that come from the federal government that are not part of the story that I try to tell. And that's why I have this nice concise book that will take up less space on your shelves. Eric,
I just want to say the paperback came out last week and is much thinner and smaller.
Yeah, I purposely
fit much more nicely into your backpack.
But all this to say that the focus on that, I think there is a way in which that still relates to experience at the local level, even though that wasn't the topic of my investigation, because I do think that, just if you take the category of essential worker, the collective experience of the pandemic was deeply mediated by these already existing categories. And most people did not know where those categories came from, but then suddenly you're classified as an essential worker and your job is to show up on the job. Somebody else doesn't have to. So, or you have a kid in school who's no longer able to go to school and is doing school on Zoom, and that's part of this technique of flattening the curve and non-pharmaceutical interventions that also has its own history. So I really want to tell a particular history of the forms of rationality and the techniques that generated that collective experience via the categories that came from the federal government.
Amy, thank you for those great questions. Let's open it up. And Mike or Milan, if you want to come and grab one of the mics. Oh, you got one already. Okay, so floor's open. See, let's do 2 questions. There's one here.
Hi. Thank you for the awesome talk. Very excited for the books. So my question is kind of about trust. It's not really a stretch to assume that the federal government, under the current administration, is going to continue to foster trust. So my question is kind of like, how do organizations that are decentralized, either at the ground level or closer to it, foster trust and kind of develop it in communities that are deeply skeptical? So I'm thinking of like deep red states or deeply red communities like Staten Island, or even some like NIMBY communities that are really reticent to put faith in institutions or people who trust and utilize science to kind of make recommendations, thinking about like climate hazards, epidemiology, and all that sort of stuff.
Let's do another question. Just we'll do 2. Did you have, I know Melina.
Okay, so my question is related to a point that I think both of you had made at some point about maybe feeling nostalgic for certain forms of expertise that are now so clearly in this political climate under attack and under siege. And maybe this is a selfish question because I'm writing a book that the second part of the title is Critiquing the Limits of Biomedical Authority. But it makes me wonder, for those of us who are also, like you, Andy, sort of loving critics of scientific facts and their production, what does this mean for our work? Does expertise in this moment need protecting from people like us who, are trained to sort of speak about it? Should we be defending expertise in this moment?
Maybe you want to take Melina's first, and then I can do the trust one.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I think I actually like to think that this critical analysis of the production of facts is useful, not to critique the overweening authority of technocratic expertise, which is one of the spaces where the field of science and technology studies first emerged, but in pointing out the fragility and precarity of facts, and that they depend upon trust relations. And that's something that the field has been pointing out from the start. And so I think from the perspective of common sense about science, scientists in particular may think the facts speak for themselves. You simply have to demonstrate the evidence, and people will accede to your knowledge claim. And we have seen during the pandemic that that's not necessarily the case, and that, in fact, a whole field of trust relations has to be sustained in order for facts to maintain themselves. So I think that we have the tools to show that. It just is a kind of different critical lens on the implications of those long-standing findings.
So just like riffing, from that to the other question about trust, there's a nice discussion in Andy's book about Gileal's work and what he talks about, this idea of vigilant trust as opposed to kind of like trust is our default way of being in the world. And what Gil argues is, trust is kind of always in play, and most people don't feel the kind of like default sense that they trust whatever you tell them. They're going to assess the claims you make with what they know and understand. And I'm guessing in the moment, the communities that you're talking about probably feel a relatively high level of trust in the White House, in the federal government. They might think, oh, this is finally someone who, hears me and gets me, and I like what I'm seeing on some issues. But there might be other issues in which they're not seeing that, and those are probably the moments for the kind of work that you're talking about. So I think, for instance, of this, the reporting of the implications of the shift in indirect costs that universities get from 60% to 15%, from the NIH with this new White House directive. And the reporting from Alabama is like the largest public employer in Alabama is a public university that has 29,000 employees, 4,000 of whom are directly on the payroll because of indirect costs that come from the NIH. And so this is one of many places where dramatic cuts will mean a lot of people are out of a job. And there's a whole kind of series of reporting projects that newspapers around the country are doing that try to document what the local losses will be. And the New York Times just did a big story that has a nice map where you can see the cost implications of this decision for different states. And it seems to me like even people in communities that feel like they trust this president more than the last one might not trust the way this government is handling this particular issue. And there's a moment for some organizing. In my book, there's a lot of distrust. And that, again, I talked about the feeling people have that they're on their own, but there's one important countervailing tendency. There's two chapters that are about kind of organizing and social movements. One is the organizing around racial justice and Black Lives Matter, and the character I profiled in Brandon English is on the cover of the book, and his story really speaks to that moment of reckoning in 2020 that, as we know now, produced incredible historic levels of energy, but also a tremendous backlash. But there's another chapter, I think it's in some ways more, that speaks more to the moment, about mutual aid networks and their extraordinary emergence in 2020 as ways for communities at a very local level to deal with hunger and economic insecurity and the difficulty of getting access to medical care and all forms of, a whole variety of forms of care that broke down. And I profiled a woman named Nuala O'Doherty, who's got an amazing story about a mutual aid network in Jackson Heights, Queens. And that one mutual aid network has kind of transformed so that instead of providing relief to people dealing with COVID, it's now, they call it the Jackson Heights Migration Center, and it's now dealing with asylum claims and immigration issues. And it's my view that there are mutual aid networks like this all over this city and all over the world that have yet to kind of fully act. And I see real potential for doing things at that level. And potentially even for crossing some of the red-blue lines that we spend a lot of time worrying about. Because I think there are some people who are clearly just super ideological, and for them it's about the party. But I think for a lot of people, there's a pragmatism about politics and policy. They feel uncertainty and insecurity. They want better goods and services and protections. And I think they feel like neither party's really been able to deliver it. So I'm guessing that this current administration has overpromised that it can deliver, and that will mean there's some real potential to do something different. More questions? Yeah. So just right behind you, and then on the other aisle.
Yeah, thanks so much. I have a question regarding the essential workers that you both covered today and also in your books. And I was asking myself, I think, Eric, you stated in your book that who is essential is also kind of expendable. And did you see like a hierarchy within essential workers during the pandemic, also in regards to maybe visibility and invisibility of specific jobs?
Just out in the next row on the left.
So thank you to both of you. Andy, I had a question about preparedness, because in many ways I see this book as a critique of this particular brand of preparedness. As you said, it was too rigid, it was a solution for a different kind of epidemic. And as Amy, I think, pointed out, it seems kind of in its technical rigidity and focus, blind to all sorts of operational, social, political complexities. So if the OMB called you tomorrow and said, look, we are setting up a new department of preparedness, and it's going to be a different kind of expertise, and it's going to be a different kind of plan, what would be some kind of broad rubrics that you would say they should
In your scenario, we don't want the actual current OMB, it's an imaginary.
consider? A new.
Yeah, while Andy is thinking, let me just say on this point about essential workers, those of you who are in Germany in 2020, here in the US, and especially in New York, there was this kind of lovely ritual of solidarity where at 7 o'clock every day at the end of the workday during the early days of the pandemic, the healthcare workers would come home and people would go outside of their buildings, open up the windows and bang pots and pans. And there was an expression of solidarity like this in many parts of the world, and a kind of note of appreciation for the medical workers. And that's great. And there's like doctors got a lot of that, and nurses got some. Melina and I have written a paper about what we think of as moral injury among nurses, what people often call nursing burnouts, just that nurses were placed in this impossible situation where there was no way for them to perform their job at the level that they feel good about, and they witnessed all kinds of horrible, lonely, isolated deaths, and were put in impossible situations, and not given nearly the level of support that they needed from their institutions or from the public, and I think not quite recognized. And yet nurses were far more recognized than the janitors and the cafeteria workers in the hospitals and the custodians in the MTA and the people who worked in the meatpacking and the poultry, industry and agricultural laborers and clerks and delivery people. It is extraordinary just how quickly we moved on. There are very few memorials to COVID workers. I was in Poughkeepsie yesterday for a work project, and there's a statue of a nurse with a mask, which is very notable because you don't see things like that very often, but I think the kind of will not to know that most of us have is just too powerful, and we haven't done it. There's a few proposals for COVID memorials. But I think, for sure, even among the essential workers, the status really mattered. And it is notable to me that when we do memorialize essential workers, we tend to memorialize the ones that are already paid more and recognized more. Not that they got enough, but that there's a whole world of people who I think we've just kind of moved on from. And I haven't seen the numbers on it, but it wouldn't surprise me to learn that their political affiliation changed in the last several years. They're obviously not happy about governance during 2020, but because we didn't want to talk much about it, I think it was like deleted from our memories as we went through 2024. We remembered the failed promises to recover, but not really what it had been like to live through 2020, and here we are.
So perhaps predictably, I'm going to give you a bureaucratic rationality-oriented response to this question around essential workers, which is that it was also quite fascinating, in addition to what Eric said, to see, given that being classified as an essential industry meant that you could keep your industry going and would not be shut down, there was also a fight among leaders of certain industries to be classified as essential. And so we have these really fascinating examples, like in California, the cannabis industry was classified as an essential industry. In Florida, the World Wrestling Federation was classified as, in a number of states, gun shops were classified as essential industries. Teachers were classified as an essential industry in certain states so that they could be forced to keep on showing up for class. You could not shut down school. So there was a real politics over what it meant to be classified as essential at that level of the federal and state level of classification. Andre, your question about what would I advise the OMB? I would first say I'm not a public health expert. I'm an anthropologist. You don't want to ask me that question. But if they insisted, I guess I would say A couple of lessons perhaps learned. One is about not relying on very narrow technical fixes. So if you think about all the billions of dollars that were spent and are continuing to be spent on the strategic national stockpile, there's a built-in structure that has to do with congressional appropriations and certain relationships between biotech companies and biotech contractors and the federal government. That means that we're still spending a lot of money storing smallpox and anthrax vaccine, which is quite expensive all around the country, millions of doses. So stay away from technical fixes that are focused on a very specific scenario. Be more oriented toward flexible capacities, and of course, the most important flexible capacity is a strong local public health system. And so that should be seen as part of a preparedness system and not as separate. That is the everyday public health demands also to what you're going to need when an emergency happens. I guess the other piece of advice, this comes from the Science Studies Scholarship at Jasanoff, is that experts should be okay with expressing humility about what they know and don't know, because a certain kind of overconfidence in what is known can later undermine the authority if it turns out that that the science is moving in different directions. Too small.
Yeah, I think it's big, and I also think that's one of the things that's very difficult to sustain with an authoritarian leader, because an expression of doubt, gets you in a lot of trouble. It's almost 7 o'clock, and I know that there's books out there, and we'd love to sign books for those of you who are longing for more because you haven't had enough Polycrisis for the night. Amy, thank you so much for such generous and valuable comments. Thank you for coming on the show. And thanks everyone. We hope to see you